It started as most things do, with a quiet night in an empty house. My father had been gone for 2 months. He died as quietly as he had lived, slipping away in his sleep without a sound, leaving behind a house full of memories and an empty chair at the kitchen table. The old place had become mine, along with everything inside it, and I had moved in almost out of necessity. My tiny apartment in the city felt like a cage, while the house, with all its creaks and shadows, offered at least some sense of space. Dad had been a quiet man. He wasn't unfriendly, but he kept his thoughts to himself. And after Mom died, he seemed to retreat further into the past. His passion was his collection. Old technology, especially the camcorder he had gotten in the 80s. He filmed everything. Family birthdays, holidays, even mundane moments like mowing the lawn or playing cards in the kitchen. I never understood it, but now, as I sat surrounded by stacks of those old VHS tapes, I found myself grateful. The tapes felt like pieces of him, fragments of a life that had slipped away. The house itself was unchanged. The same faded wallpaper lined the hallway, the same floral armchair sat beside the TV, and the same old wood stove crackled with a fire that struggled to chase away the autumn chill. But the silence was new. Without my father's shuffling footsteps, the place seemed to breathe differently, as if it had fallen into a deeper kind of sleep. I found myself drawn to the tapes late at night, especially when sleep wouldn't come. I'd pop one into the VHS player and sit on the old couch, letting the grainy footage of past Christmases and summer cookouts wash over me. It was comforting in a way to see those simpler times play out on the screen, but it also made the house feel emptier than ever. It was one of those nights, long past midnight with the wind rattling the windows, that I first saw him. I had been watching a tape from 1993, a family barbecue in the backyard. The footage was unsteady, as it always was when Dad was behind the camera, but it captured everything. My mother, laughing as she tried to keep my little sister's hands out of the potato salad. My younger self, running around with a water gun. My dad's voice chuckling behind the lens. It was a happy scene, the kind of moment you never think to appreciate until years later. As the tape came to an end, the familiar static filled the screen, a white hiss that buzzed through the room. I reached for the remote to rewind, but something made me pause. There, in the flickering black and white noise, I saw somethings. It was barely more than a shadow, standing just behind the corner of the house, half hidden in the static. It was tall, its shape blurred by the poor quality of the recording, but it was there, watching the scene unfold. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen. My mind raced with possible explanations. Maybe it was my imagination, or a trick of the light caught in the poor resolution. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. There was a figure in the static, and it was staring directly at the camera. I rewound the tape, my hands shaking slightly, but when I played it again, the figure was gone. The screen showed nothing but my family, smiling and laughing, no shadow lurking in the background. I watched it through twice, then a third time, but it was as if the figure had never been there at all. I let out a shaky breath and laughed at myself, the sound harsh and hollow in the empty room. It had to be a glitch. An old tape like this, recorded on outdated equipment, was bound to have some quirks. Maybe I was just seeing things in the noise. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the wind howling outside. I told myself it was nothing, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. The next night, I tried to ignore the tapes. I put on some music, read a book, even called my friend Tom for a chat, trying to fill the silence with anything but the endless hum of the old VHS player. But the tapes called to me, sitting there in their dusty boxes, and I found myself reaching for another one before the night was over. This time, it was a recording from a family vacation, a beach trip, 1995. I remembered it vaguely, building sandcastles with my sister, splashing in the waves while Dad filmed from his folding chair. The tape flickered with that same low hum of nostalgia, but now it was tinged with a sense of unease. I watched the whole thing through, scanning the background for any sign of the figure I'd seen before, but there was nothing. Just the waves, the laughter, and the grainy sunlight. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the house creak and groan around me. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the faint hum of the wood stove and the occasional pop of the embers. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep. At some point, I drifted off, only to be woken by a strange sound, a soft, rhythmic crackling, like static coming from far away. I sat up, blinking in the darkness, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound seemed to be coming from downstairs, from the direction of the living room. I hesitated, my hands gripping the edge of the blanket, but then I swung my legs over the side of the bed and crept down the hall. As I descended the stairs, the static grew louder, filling the darkness with its unsettling hum. I reached the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. The TV was on, even though I was certain I'd turned it off. The screen was filled with swirling static, and in the center of the frame, barely visible through the flickering noise, was a face. The face has turned directly toward my direction. I scrambled for the remote, but it refused to work. The TV wouldn't power down, no matter how many times I hit the button. I reached for the plug, yanking it from the wall, but the screen stayed on, the figure shifting closer with every flicker of static. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I stumbled backward, my eyes glued to the screen. And then, just as the figure's hand seemed to reach out toward me, the screen went black. The room plunged into silence. I stood there in the darkness, my hands shaking, my mind racing. The TV was off, the static gone, but the house felt colder than ever. The next morning, the events of the night before played on a loop in my mind. It all felt like some twisted dream. But as I stood in the cold light of dawn, staring at the unplugged TV set that sat quietly in the corner, I knew it had been real. Too real. I avoided the tapes that day. Tried to keep busy, cleaning out old boxes in the attic, organizing my father's bookshelves, anything to keep my mind off what I had seen. But the unease clung to me, like the static from the screen had soaked into my skin. Every creak of the house, every shift of the shadows outside the windows, made my heart race. When night fell, the dread crept back in, settling in my chest like a heavy weight. I told myself I wouldn't watch any more tapes, that I'd leave them in their dusty boxes where they belonged. But as the hours stretched on, the silence of the house became unbearable, pressing in on me from all sides. I found myself back in the living room, a fresh tape in hand, the old VHS player humming softly as it drew the cassette inside. My fingers shook as I pressed play, but a part of me, some sick, twisted part, needed to see if the figure would appear again. This time, it was a recording of a birthday party. My 10th birthday, judging by the banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Alex," in my mother's neat handwriting. The footage was shaky, the colors slightly washed out from years of wear, but the scene was clear. My younger self was grinning at the camera, my face smudged with frosting as I opened gifts beside a towering cake. At first everything seemed normal, just a memory caught on tape, a glimpse of a simpler time. But as the camera panned across the room, I saw him again. I turned off the TV, but the silence that followed was worse than the static. It was a suffocating, heavy stillness. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called Tom. He picked up after a few rings, his voice groggy from sleep. "Alex, it's 3 a.m, he mumbled. "What's going on?" I saw something, I stammered, pacing the living room, my free hand clenched into a fist. "On the tapes. There's this guy, or I don't know what it is, but he keeps showing up in the background. And last night I think he was here, like actually here." Tom sighed, and I could practically hear him rubbing his eyes, trying to make sense of my rambling. "Alex, you're grieving. You've been watching those tapes nonstop. It's probably just messing with your head. No, you don't get it, I insisted, my voice rising in desperation. He's real, Tom. He's in the house. I know it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Tom spoke again, his tone was softer, almost pitying. Look, I think you need to take a break. Get some fresh air. You've been cooped up in that place for too long. Why don't I come by tomorrow and we'll go out for a bit, okay? I wanted to argue, to make him understand, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. He thought I was losing it. Hell, maybe I was. But the fear that clawed at my insides was real, and I couldn't ignore it. Yeah, sure, I lied. Tomorrow. We hung up and I stood there in the dark, staring at the TV screen, my reflection dimly visible in the glass. For a moment I thought I saw a movement behind me, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. I spun around, but the room was empty. I went to bed with the lights on that night, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept seeing the figure in my mind, the way he loomed in the background of those old tapes, blending with the static, and deep down I knew that whatever he wasn't done with me. The next day, Tom came by as promised, but I didn't bring up the tapes again. I could see the concern in his eyes, the way he kept glancing at me like I was a fragile thing about to break. We went for a drive, grabbed some lunch at a diner on the edge of town, and talked about everything except the strange events of the past few nights. It was a relief, in a way, to pretend that everything was normal. But even as I sat across from Tom, sipping my coffee, I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me, that the figure was still lurking in the corners of my vision, just waiting for me to slip back into his world. When I returned to the house that evening, I decided to go straight to the bedroom and try to forget about the tapes, about the eerie events. That night, the static seeped into my dreams. I found myself standing in the living room, surrounded by darkness, the TV's cold glow the only light. The static crackled, filling the air with its harsh hum, and through the haze, I could see the figure, closer than ever, its shape rippling with the noise. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze boring into me, felt it reaching out across the distance between us. I woke up gasping, the darkness of the room pressing in around me as if the dream hadn't truly ended. Sweat clung to my skin, my breath catching in my chest. I checked the clock, just past 3 in the morning. I eventually drifted off to sleep again. I called Tom the next morning. I tried to keep my voice steady, to make it sound like I was just in need of a distraction, but the unease crept into my words. Hey Tom, can we meet up somewhere? I could use a break. He paused, his tone cautious. You doing okay, man? Yeah, just haven't been sleeping much. I tried to force a chuckle, but it came out brittle. Too many late nights with those old tapes. Tom hesitated before replying, and I could hear the concern bleeding into his voice. Let's grab lunch. I think you could use some fresh air. When I met him at the diner, he gave me a long, searching look, like he was trying to see through whatever mask I was wearing. We made small talk, ate our meals, but I couldn't focus. Every time a reflection caught my eye, on the window, in the chrome edge of the napkin holder, I thought I saw something shift, a flicker of a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I kept my mouth shut though. I'd tried to explain what was happening before and I'd seen the doubt in his eyes. He thought I was losing it, and I couldn't blame him. But as we left the diner, he caught my arm. You know, you don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice gentle. Whatever you're dealing with. Just call me if you need anything, okay? I nodded, giving him a weak smile. Yeah, thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. That night, the tension in the house was worse than ever. This time, I didn't even bother with the tapes. I just sat on the couch, staring at the dark screen, listening to the silence that pressed against the walls. My mind played tricks on me, making me think I heard the faint crackle of static beneath the hum of the wood stove. I closed my eyes, trying to will the fear away, but when I opened them again, I saw him, standing in the hallway, just beyond the archway, barely visible in the shadows. My whole body freezing in place as my eyes locked onto the figure. He was closer than he'd ever been, almost clear enough to see his face, but the darkness clung to him like a shroud, warping the edges of his form. He stood there, motionless, watching me with that same unnerving patience. I blinked, and he was gone. I shot to my feet, heart pounding in my chest, and stumbled toward the hallway, flipping on the lights. The space was empty, the shadows retreating to the corners, but the air felt wrong, thicker, colder, as if his presence had left a residue behind. I backed away, my pulse roaring in my ears. When I looked into the hallway mirror, my reflection stared back at me, distorted, delayed, moving half a second slower than I did. My breath hitched as I watched my reflection slowly turn its head, looking over its shoulder at something I couldn't see. I whipped around, expecting to see the figure standing behind me, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was there, standing directly behind my reflection, its face lost in shadow. A hand reached out toward me, its long fingers brushing against the glass, as if trying to break through. I kicked the mirror, the glass shattering on the floor, each shard reflecting a different piece of the figure, as if it was trapped inside. But even in the broken reflections, his form remained whole, staring back at me from every angle. I bolted out of the hallway, my breaths coming in sharp, panicked gasps. I could feel his presence behind me, feel the weight of his gaze, but I didn't dare look back. I shut myself in my bedroom, slamming the door and locking it, as if a simple lock could keep him out. The house creaked and groaned around me, the old wood shifting in the night, but beneath the usual noises, I could hear it again. The faint, rhythmic crackle of static, like a voice trying to reach me through the walls. Sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the edge of the bed, gripping the edge of the blanket like it could protect me. The darkness of the room seemed alive, shifting with every flicker of my dying flashlight. I stared at the shadows until dawn, waiting for the figure to step out of them. When the first light of morning broke through the windows, I allowed myself to breathe again. But I knew that this wasn't over. The figure had found a way into my world, slipping through the cracks in the static, and I was no longer sure where reality ended and the nightmare began. Morning offered no real comfort. The sunlight seeped through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor, but I could still feel the figure's presence, lingering just outside my field of vision. The shards of the broken mirror lay scattered across the hallway, each piece glinting with fractured reflections that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I forced myself to clean up the mess, trying to focus on the mundane task. But every time I caught a glimpse of my face in a piece of glass, I expected to see him behind me again. My hands trembled as I swept the shards into a dustpan, and I finally threw them away. That afternoon, I decided to visit Tom. I needed to get out of the house, away from the tapes, away from the shadows that seemed to be closing in around me. He lived in a small apartment on the other side of town, and the drive was uneventful, the sun casting a dull gray light over the streets. When Tom opened the door, he gave me a cautious smile, but I could see the worry in his eyes. His apartment was small and cluttered, with stacks of books and an old guitar propped up in the corner. It was a far cry from the empty space I'd been living in, but it felt more alive, more real. "Hey, Alex," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to force a smile, but it felt wrong on my face. Something like that. He led me to the living room, where we sat down on a pair of mismatched armchairs. I kept my gaze on the floor, trying to find the words to explain what had been happening. But every time I opened my mouth, the memory of the figure standing behind me, reaching out through the mirror, choked off the words. Tom cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You know you can talk to me anything, right? I'm here to help." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look him in the eye. "It's not just the tapes, Tom. It's like there's something in the house, something that's using the static to reach me." He raised an eyebrow, his expression caught between concern and disbelief. "Alex, man, I think you've been cooped up in that place for too long. Maybe you need to just listen to me." I interrupted, the urgency in my voice surprising even myself. It's not just in the tapes anymore. It's inside the house. I've seen it. Tom's smile faded and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Okay, let's say for a second that what you're saying is real. What do you think it wants? I shook my head, my hands clenching into fists. I don't know, but it's getting closer. I can feel it. I don't know how to stop it. Tom studied me for a long moment, then let out a slow sigh. Look, why don't you stay here tonight? You don't have to go back to that house right away. Maybe a change of scenery will help. The offer was tempting. The thought of sleeping in a place that wasn't haunted by the figure's presence, that wasn't filled with the endless hum of static, was almost enough to make me agree. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The figure had already found me, and I couldn't escape it by running. I managed a weak smile. Thanks, Tom, but I think I need to face this. Whatever it is, it's not going away. He frowned, his worry deepening. Just promise me you'll call if things get worse, okay? I don't want you doing anything reckless. I nodded, trying to hide the doubt that gnawed at me. We talked for a while longer, keeping the conversation light, but the tension between us never fully eased. When I finally left his apartment, the sky had turned a dull gray, and the air felt heavy with the promise of rain. The drive back to the house felt like returning to a prison. The closer I got, the heavier my chest felt, like an invisible weight was pressing down on me. The house loomed at the end of the driveway, its windows dark and uninviting, and for a moment I considered turning back, driving until I ran out of road. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Whatever was happening, I had to face it. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the door echoing through the empty rooms. The air inside was colder than it should have been, and as I moved through the hallway, I caught a faint sound of static. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to keep moving, heading for the living room. As I reached the living room, the VHS was already playing a footage. I didn't question it anymore. As I looked at the screen, I could see an ordinary day in the backyard, my father filming a lazy Sunday afternoon. But the figure was already there, standing in the middle of the yard, his back to the camera. He was so clear now, so solid. I paused the tape, leaning in closer, my breath fogging the screen. The figure's head began to turn, slow and deliberate, as if he could sense my attention. And then, just as his face came into view, the screen went black. A soft, rhythmic crackling filled the room, the static whispering through the speakers. I reached for the remote, but the image on the screen shifted, warping into a reflection of the living room. Only this time, it wasn't a recording. It was me, sitting on the couch, staring at the screen in real time. And behind me, in the reflection, the figure stood just inside the archway, his face a shadowed blur. I spun around, my heart lurching in my chest, but the archway was empty. When I looked back at the screen, the figure was closer, moving toward the camera, his limbs jerking with unnatural speed. The static grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, filling the room with its dissonant hum. I tried to turn off the TV, to yank the tape from the player, but the buttons wouldn't respond, my hands slipping against the plastic. The figure reached the edge of the frame, his hand stretching toward the glass, fingers long and thin. Just as his hand touched the screen, the TV shattered, the image breaking apart into 1,000 splinters. The glass exploded outward, and I threw my arms up, stumbling backward as shards rained down around me. When the noise finally died, I lowered my arms, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The TV was a ruin. The screen cracked and dark, but the air around me felt different, thicker, like the static had spilled out into the room. I turned slowly, expecting to find him standing behind me, but there was nothing. Only the ruined TV and the cold emptiness of the house. But as I stood there, my chest heaving with fear, I heard a voice, soft and distorted, like a radio signal fading in and out. "You can't escape." I spent the rest of the night searching through the house, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. I tore through old boxes, rifled through drawers, pulled apart closets that hadn't been opened in years. But it wasn't until I stumbled across an old wooden chest in the attic that I found what I was looking for. Inside, wrapped in a dusty blanket, was a leather-bound journal, brittle with age. My father's handwriting filled the pages, the ink faded but still legible. As I flipped through the entries, a sense of dread settled over me. Most of it was mundane, notes about the weather, little observations about the town, sketches of the plants he grew in the backyard. But buried between the everyday details were cryptic passages, written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl. The voices are clearer now. They speak through the static, but only when I'm alone. They know I can hear them. It's not a glitch, it's something else. It moves between the frames, like it's looking for a way out. I can feel it watching. The ritual? I thought it was just folklore, but the shadows have changed. They reach out, try to follow me into the light. I need to finish what I started before it's too late. The pages were filled with drawings of symbols, circles, runes, strange markings that I couldn't decipher. But in the margins of one page, written in shaky letters, were instructions for something he called the banishing. It was a ritual, ancient and obscure, designed to trap entities that crossed the boundaries between worlds. The steps were written in detail, playing tapes in reverse, using mirrors and salt to reflect the entity's presence, trapping it back inside the static where it belonged. But there was a warning, scrawled across the bottom of the page in desperate, uneven lines. If the ritual fails, it will not be contained and it will take everything. I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. My father had known. He had known about the figure, about the way it seeped into the tapes, the way it followed him through the static. I glanced around the attic, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows, but I was alone. For now. The thought of performing the ritual, of following in my father's footsteps, sent a chill through me, but I didn't have a choice. The air in the house felt wrong, charged with a presence that wasn't supposed to exist. The TV lay shattered, glass littering the floor. His presence seeped into every corner, thick and cold, like a fog that I couldn't shake off. I could feel him moving through the rooms, the air shifting around him, but he never revealed himself fully. It was as if he was playing a game, watching me, testing the boundaries of his new existence. I had to get him back into the VHS tapes. It was the only way. The tapes were his anchor, the bridge between this world and wherever he came from. I scavenged the remains of my father's ritual, gathering the few tools that had survived the chaos. The old VHS player, a box of blank tapes, a dusty portable TV from the attic that was still intact. The screen was small, barely functional, but it would have to do. I brought everything to the living room, spreading the supplies across the floor like a battlefield map. The house groaned around me, the shadows twisting in the corners, but I forced myself to ignore them. I plugged in the TV and set up the VHS player, my hands shaking as I loaded a blank tape. My father's notes were smudged, nearly illegible, but one line stood out. He's bound by his image. Use the static, use the mirror. I glanced around the room to find the only mirror left. I positioned it in front of the TV screen, angling it to catch the reflection. It would have to be enough. With the TV and VHS player ready, I stood back, the blank tape turning slowly inside the machine. I needed him to show himself. I needed him to see his own reflection, to be drawn back into the world where he belonged. "Come on," I whispered into the silence, my voice trembling. "I know you're here." For a moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the soft whirring of the tape as it recorded the empty room, the screen of the small TV flickering with static. But then, the air grew colder, thickening with a presence that sent a shiver crawling down my spine. He was behind me. I didn't dare turn around. If I looked at him directly, I knew he'd vanish back into the shadows. I watched through the TV's reflection as a dark shape began to solidify in the frame, just behind where I stood. The figure was taller than I remembered, his limbs bending at unnatural angles, his face hidden in a haze of static. But he was there, caught between worlds, half-formed, his outline shifting like smoke in the dim light. The figure twitched, his head tilting in a way that made my stomach turn. He stepped closer, his shape bending the air around him, and for a moment, I thought he might reach out, wrap those long fingers around my throat. But he hesitated, staring into the reflection, into the distorted image of himself caught in the mirror. I hit record on the VHS player, and the tape started capturing the image on the screen, the reflection of the figure, distorted by the static. The TV hummed, the screen flickering as it struggled to hold the figure's shape, and I felt a shift in the air, like a breath being drawn inward. His form wavered as if he was caught in a strong wind, and I felt his presence slipping, being pulled toward the TV. The static roared, growing louder, filling the room with a sound like grinding teeth. It was working. It had to be working. I stepped back, giving him room to be drawn in, but the figure jerked, twisting violently as if resisting the pull. His face, blurred, featureless, turned toward me, and I felt a surge of cold that drove the air from my lungs. His form stretched, warping the reflection, and I could see the hatred burning behind the empty void of his eyes. The mirror flared with a cold, unnatural light, and the figure let out a sound, a distorted, high-pitched wail that made my bones ache. He twisted in the reflection, his shape folding in on itself, and I felt a powerful force pulling him toward the TV like a vacuum sucking in smoke. The screen crackled, the image warping as his form blurred into the static, but his hand lashed out, striking the mirror, and a web of cracks spread across the glass. I stumbled back, but I held the mirror steady, forcing him to confront his own image. His shape twisted again, shrinking back toward the TV, his limbs bending in impossible directions, as if he was being sucked into a black hole. The static on the screen flared, the noise reaching a deafening pitch, and then, with a final shuddering jolt, he was gone, pulled back into the VHS tape. The TV screen went dark, the whirring of the VHS player slowing to a stop. The room was silent again, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of his presence finally lifted. I sank to my knees. I stared at the TV, half expecting him to burst back out, but the screen remained dark. I hit eject, and the tape slid out of the player, warm to the touch, the plastic casing humming faintly with static. I held the tape in my hands, feeling its weight. I had done it. I had trapped him back inside. But even as I stared at the blank label, I could hear a faint crackling, like a distant radio signal. The figure was still there, inside the tape, waiting for someone to make the mistake of playing it again. The next morning, I took the tape out to the backyard. The sky was gray, a cold wind rustling through the trees. I doused the tape in gasoline, along with the shards of the mirror and the broken remains of the VHS player, then lit a match. The fire roared to life, consuming the plastic and glass, sending up thick black smoke that curled into the sky. The tape melted, warping and twisting in the flames, and the static hum faded into the crackling of the fire. I watched until there was nothing left but ashes, until the smell of burning plastic stung my eyes and throat. The house behind me was silent, empty, no longer haunted by shadows. But as I turned away from the fire, I couldn't shake the sense that a part of him was still watching, lingering in the edges of my memory. But I wouldn't let it consume me, not again. The days after the fire felt like waking up from a nightmare. The house was finally quiet, no more cold drafts carrying whispers through the halls, no more flickering shadows that moved when I wasn't looking. The air felt clean, empty in a way that I hadn't realized I'd missed.